to this afternoon session from a very warm Brussels. So I hope wherever you are. Okay, so I hope from wherever you are that it's also warm. So I have the pleasure to moderate this webinar with our distinguished guests and speakers, and I will introduce them later as we go along. We would like this event to be as interactive as possible. So we would really invite you to put any comments or questions that you have into the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and we will pull out the questions. We will at the end, after the speakers, have a moment to actually, if you want to intervene, if you would like to take the so-called floor or the screen, please just put your name in and we will give you the floor as well. We want to also, to make sure that you really, any questions that you have, any comments that you have, please don't hesitate. This is the moment, because we're very happy to be at the beginning of a process of a directive, a proposed directive on violence against women. It's on the table now. So today we're going to discuss towards a future of Europe without violence against women. And our question is, can the recent proposed directive on violence against women and domestic violence make this happen? And I just want to share something with you, if I may. I have, violence against women was one of the first issues that I personally worked on many, many years ago. And at that time, we were told, woo, violence against women is a private affair, and it certainly has nothing to do with European policies. So I'm very pleased and happy today to see that we have a proposed directive on the agenda. And what it shows, I think, over time, is that it happens really at a time when, for the first time ever, the European Commission is headed by a woman president. And I think that shows that women's leadership does make a difference. And I just want to also say that many years ago, when the then commissioner, a Swedish commissioner, Anita Gradin, who was responsible for home affairs, and she put the issue of trafficking against women for the purpose of sexual exploitation on the agenda and brought it into her mandate. And it's really interesting today that that really is the legal basis upon which this directive is now being proposed. So it really does take time, it takes perseverance, and I think above all, it takes a political will. And we've also just had the conclusions from the Conference on the Future of Europe, just been adopted. I think we will all agree that there can be no future without really not only tackling, addressing, but eliminating violence against women. So all of this comes together as we all move forward. So today we're going to explore in more detail the scope and the content of the proposed directive. And there are some questions that I would invite you all to keep in mind. Is it fit for purpose? What are the obstacles that are likely to be encountered on the way? And will the backlash particularly regarding the Istanbul Convention, play a role in moving forward with this directive? So there's some of the questions that I would just like you to keep in mind as we move forward. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our renowned panel. They all represent key institutional actors, and they will all be playing a key role as we move forward in ensuring both that this directive will be adopted, but both in terms of a vision, legislation, and a political process. So without much ado, I'm going to move to our first speaker. And I'm very, very happy, and thank you so much, Lesia Radelici, for being with us today, because I know that you've got an extremely busy schedule. And you are a member of the Commissioner Dalli's cabinet. Commissioner Dalli is the commissioner responsible for equality. And Lesia is responsible for gender equality within the cabinet. And we've known Lesia for a long, long time. And we know that we really have an ally out there with us. And we're here to support you too. I want you to know that too. that within and without, we're together. We're together in this. And I would just like to ask you, Lesia, first of all, really to start off with the basics. Let's start at the beginning, because perhaps some of you in this webinar this afternoon don't really know the full content of the proposal itself. So my first question to you would be, can you give an overview of the content, the scope of the proposed directive? And I think also that you may have to leave us before the end. So I'm going to also put to you a second question, which is a burning question that everybody is asking. Can you explain why violence against women is excluded from the Euro crime list? So first of all, let's start at the beginning and please let us know what is in the directive, the content, and what are the strong points? What are the more challenging issues? So thank you very much, Lesia. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you to the G5 Plus to invite me and to have this discussion together, because I think that it's not just you being grateful for working together, but also from our side, we're grateful to have your support, ongoing support on this issue, but also on other files to advance gender equality. And you've said it, I mean, a future of Europe cannot happen without making sure that gender equality is at its core. And that's where I also would like to start, because it all started with the vision that we had with our gender equality strategy, saying that we want a Europe where women and girls in all their diversity can lead, thrive, and be free from violence. And the president of the commission, and as you said, Mary, the first woman commissioner president, had put this high on her agenda. She wanted the commission to do everything we could in order to eliminate violence against women and girls. And so Commissioner Dalli, with her portfolio of equality, was tasked with that. And we took this straight on and looked at the avenues that we could take this forward. Because, as you also mentioned, there has been already on the table of EU politics and EU negotiations another piece of legislation, the Istanbul Convention, on the table. And for us, and in particular for Commissioner Dalli, this is the gold standard on this issue and on advancing on this matter. But the reality was what it was. There was a blockage within the council now that has been solved to a certain extent, but we didn't want to sit and not do anything. So what we did is to start drafting and thinking on how to put forward a proposal for a directive on violence against women and domestic violence. One, because I mean, there are different pieces of legislations and actions at EU level that deal with some aspects of combating violence against women, on enhancing gender equality, but they were all over the place. So what we wanted to do is make sure that everything was put in one and the same document. At the same time, we also wanted to have minimum standards that would apply across the EU, so that it didn't matter where as a woman you were living, but that you would be guaranteed some same standards when it comes to combating violence and domestic violence across the EU. And the third point is, yes, we wanted to still live up to our international standards when it comes to combating violence against women and domestic violence. And to have this comprehensive approach, that's why we put forward this proposal. Now, what is important to keep in mind is the legal basis that we could use and that we used for this proposal. And that's Article 83(1) of the treaty, which is the existing article that is the Eurocrimes article, as we call it. And there are two aspects that we have used for our proposal, and it's the exploitation of women and children on the one side, and the other side, the computer crime. And we use that in order to be able to cover as much as possible under EU law, and in order to be able to criminalize certain forms of violence against women. So with that in mind, we have put forward this proposal. And if I'm now looking at the structure of the proposal, the first part of the proposal looks a little bit at the definitions, at the notions, and so forth. And we managed to put in a reference or a definition of violence against women that also refers to gender-based violence. Now, the domestic violence part is where we are able to go broader than just violence against women, because that's some things that people did ask us, why violence against women, not gender-based violence, and that is exactly because of the fact that we have the legal basis that we have. So we cannot go around that, and that's why it is violence against women and domestic violence. And the novelty with this proposal is that we have been able to criminalize certain forms of violence. In a nutshell, that covers rape, that covers FGM, and that covers some forms of online violence. And so where we have gone a bit wider than the Istanbul Convention, and I'm always careful what I say, because I know we have the expert of the Istanbul Convention amongst us, Marcelina. But that's the online violence part. But let me come back to the rape and FGM. So rape, what the novelty is even though rape is criminalized in all EU member states, there where we are making a difference is that the definition of rape includes the notion of consent. And that is not the case in all member states. So we have managed to put that in. FGM also has not been criminalized in all member states. So that's where we are able to make a difference. And as I said, on the online violence, we have indeed included several articles that deal with online violence, such as sharing, illegal sharing of images, hate speech based on sex or gender online, cyber stalking, and cyber harassment. So those are quite new issues that we are criminalizing within the EU. Now, all the other parts of the directive are very much in line with what the Istanbul Convention is doing. What I mean by that, it is about prevention, it is about protection, it is about access to justice, and it is about coordination. And there, I would like to take also a little bit the different parts apart to say what exactly we have been able to bring in as novelties. So in terms of protection of victims and access to justice, we know that one of the issues is that the underreporting. So we were very much aware that we needed to facilitate the reporting for victims of violence and domestic violence. And so there we are looking at, for example, how authorities can more quicker react and be much more adequate in the way that they analyze the urgency and the needs, how they protect the victims. We also looked at how to make sure that we have the notion of a one-stop shop approach, meaning that victims would have just one place where they go report, but then also have access to justice and different types of support that they would need in combating violence or in addressing or for the perpetrator to be addressed. What we also tried to do, for example, in this directive is to reinforce, for example, the role of equality bodies. a little bit also in this mindset that I just explained, to make it easier for victims. So meaning that equality bodies could also have the role of not just providing information, but accompanying victims in their process of being defended in front of the court. In terms of the victims to support, now there may be also some people might have heard that, well, or said, well, there is already the Victims' Rights Directive. Why do you need a specific chapter here in this directive? Well, there again, we believe that victims of sexual violence, victims of harassment at work, victims of FGM need specialized support. And there we go quite in detail what we hear about specialized support. That can be medical, that can be psychological, and that can be at different stages in the process of accompanying victims. So we made sure that the specialized support to victims of violence against women and domestic violence is being addressed. Under that same chapter, we also make reference to this helpline at EU level that had been launched by the German presidency and was then, the idea was launched by the EU presidency and would encourage member states that don't have that don't have helplines for violence violence of women or domestic violence, that they would put this in place and that it would be available 24/7 and free of charge. The European number would then be used and link those national numbers that already exist, so that actually across the EU, if you were to be in a situation where you needed that, you would just use the EU number. Then in terms of, oh yeah, and also the shelter issue, not to forget, we also have a reference to the shelter issue, that there needs to be insurance to have access to shelter, and that it should be adequate and sufficient. But of course, shelter should always be a short-term solution and an emergency solution, because we believe that we need to help women to get back on their feet, and that also work needs to be done towards the perpetrators. And that's what brings me to the whole prevention aspect of the proposal. So in the prevention chapter, there is a big part that is dedicated to training of professionals, and that's and that we think of professionals that have direct contact with victims, so that can be in the legal system as well as authorities, but also in the medical sector, as well as education. But also, for example, media. I mean, we have recently heard quite a few cases of sexual harassment in media, and media often plays not an exemplary role, but an important role in terms of image and messaging. And so therefore, we also felt that it would be important to provide training in that field specifically. And then there are the intervention programs, as I mentioned before, to work with perpetrators in order to also address the issue at the basis, meaning those that commit the violence, and so that there are also programs available to help them. And then the last part of the proposal is everything covering coordination and cooperation. So that is making sure that there is coordination and cooperation between the different services, because that's also an issue. If we see that services work next to each other, that sometimes women are or victims of domestic violence miss out on certain support that they should have, but also coordination between member states on best practices, on exchanging of information, and so forth. And the data collection makes an important part of this coordination, because if we want to know what is happening on the ground, and we saw that very much with the COVID crisis, that if there is no data collection, it is also very difficult to address the issues with specific policies. But also, if we then want to see how things are across the EU, if data is collected in a different manner, it makes it very difficult to compare, but also to move forward in the same way and on the same pace. So that's in a nutshell the directive, what we have tried to put on the table. And as you know now, I mean, it is up to the Parliament and the Council to work on their position. And once they have the position, we will be able to negotiate. But we are still at an early stage here, I think. So that's on the presentation. I don't know if you want me to already move to the Eurocrimes.
Yeah, and perhaps, I don't know if you, I think you need to leave us a little bit sooner. So I know that this is a burning question. Everybody's asking it. So if you would like to maybe respond to it now, why has it been excluded as Eurocrime? Thank you.
Well, the thing, in order for the Eurocrimes list to be expanded or extended, obviously you need unanimity in order to do that. And the thing is that they don't want to limit it to certain issues only. So by saying that we would extend the list of Eurocrimes to hate speech and hate crime, this would allow a broader approach later on. But first, what needs to be done is to accept that this list of Eurocrimes, so Article 83.1, can be extended, and that's, I mean, still in the process of being done so. And then once this is extended, then we can start working on hate speech and hate crime and what this can entail. And so there, but to be seen at long term, what this can include. So it's not that it's excluded as such yet.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And I'm sure there'll be many comments coming back on that particular issue, because as we said, there was the bold move to put the directive on the agenda. So maybe we need a more bolder move as well to put, the Eurocrime as well. So I understand what you're saying, that it's a kind of a two-tier process, and that we have to wait until that's done. So perhaps that's one of the challenges moving forward in terms of moving this directive through the process. So that's something that perhaps we all need to be very aware of, and to have some very good arguments come together to work around these issues as well. But thank you so much for providing the overall content. I think that you have really spelt out what's in there, and we will see later on when we are talking with Marceline, how does it complement the Istanbul Convention? Is it, we call it its sister to the Istanbul Convention, and we know that too has been meeting a lot of resistance, so to speak. So we have to see how we can move ahead together in terms of this particular directive. I'm sure if there are questions, please don't hesitate to put them into the chat, and we will then be collecting them, looking at them, and we'll get back afterwards to put any questions or any comments on that to you. But thank you so much for giving us that overview. I think that was really important, so that everybody knows what exactly is in there, and the fact that it takes into consideration as well our changing world, and particularly online violence, the cyber world, and that space, which probably is one of the really is important, but it's probably a loop, but there was probably something missing as well in other processes. So thank you so much for that. So I'm now going to move to our second speaker, and it's with great pleasure that I invite Soraya Rodriguez Ramos, who is Spanish MEP, member of the European Parliament, and Soraya is a member of the Renew group. She's a member of the FAM committee and has recently been appointed the coordinator for her group, Renew, in the FAM committee. Now, Soraya, it's a bit probably unfair to ask you to speak on behalf of the European Parliament. We know that that's not possible because the European Parliament has yet to designate the committees that will be responsible and also the rapporteurs. So that, but you know, as the European Parliament, there will be a major role to play because it is a co-decision procedure as well. So it's going to be really, you're going to have a very important role. So putting that aside, we know that you are an engaged feminist, and we know that you have been also an ally in relation to this particular piece of legislation. So I'd like to ask you, so what, maybe give us some of your expectations moving forward in terms of the legislative procedure, but in the content for the European Parliament as well. And perhaps then secondly, you could say what, in your view, what you think the challenges are moving forward for the European Parliament to reach a consensus, and how will you engage with your own political group across the political spectrum with also other political groups, and also linking it to your own constituency in Spain, because this is going to be vital that we have constituents throughout the European Union that will also be linking into the process as well, so that together we can make a real strong push to make this happen. So thank you very much, Soraya. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The first question, my expectations are high. That is for sure. The 8th of March was an important day for more than 228 million European women, with the presentation of this first legislative proposal at EU level to combat violence against women. The introduction of common rules across the EU to fight specific types of violence against women will, without doubt, improve prevention, increase protection, and reinforce the punishment of perpetrators. The legislative proposal is a good basis for creating a European framework for combating and preventing gender-based violence. If implemented, the proposals will make it easier for EU states to share best practices, have a common definition of rape, have comparable data of gender-based violence at EU level, and explicitly outlaw acts such as female genital mutilation, cyber bullying, and other forms of online gender-based violence. It is a first step in the right direction. However, the legislative procedure gives us a window of opportunity to improve some of its parts. First of all, I would like to point out that the legal basis for this directive should have been Article 83 of the treaty. Is clear. The requirements, seriousness, cross-border dimension, etc., for such an inclusion are met. Therefore, gender-based violence should have been included as a Eurocrime. I want to stress that it is a shame that at EU level there is still some doubt that gender-based violence is a crime as serious as money laundering or corruption. It's true that the European Union has presented a communication to extend the list of EU crimes to hate speech and hate crime. Here, I want to point out that this possible inclusion to the treaty could never be the legal basis for the gender-based violence directive. Hate crimes, hate speech are not the adequate legal basis to fight against all forms of gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is based on structural inequalities. Women are killed by their partner, not because their partners hate them, but because they don't respect their freedom, they don't respect their decision. Women are murdered when their partners cannot accept that women have their freedom back. This is the reality. Secondly, we cannot forget that this proposal does not cover all forms of violence against women. This is an important point. This directive needs to be improved at the level of the European Parliament in this regard. We must include those types of violence against women in the document, which I understand their absence is not justified, as they would not create problems at the Council's level. I am thinking, for example, of forced marriages, which is mentioned at the beginning of the document, but then there are not specific measures developed in the articles. Then we must also include, and I will work in this regard for the European Parliament, to include other types of violence against women that would create such problems, but that we need to ensure they are present in the regulation. Of course, I am thinking of sexual and reproductive health and rights and the right to abortion, for example. And thirdly, another dimension which is reflected, but I believe it must be strengthened, is the specific protection and support for children of victims of gender-based violence. Article 33 focuses on the support for child victims, and Article 34 on the safety of children, including focuses on the security of minors. In my opinion, the directive should make much more specific calls on economic support and easy bureaucratic process to access the specific helps offered by the state for orphans of gender-based violence. Several organizations in Spain have been fighting for these elements for a long time, and I believe that it is an important reality. Most victims of violence against women leave children behind after their mother, and the state must offer them the correct level of protection and support. And in relation to the second question, the challenge uses for the European reach consensus, the principal obstacles. Okay, the first challenge we are going to face in the European Parliament is the anti-gender movement and the extreme right-wing groups. They are, of course, present both in the Parliament and in all European countries. All these movements consider invalid the concept of gender-based violence, and they rather use the terminology of intrafamily violence. It seems incredible to think that after all the generations of women that have fought for our rights, we are now facing such a strong denying some of the most basic concepts, such as the specific forms of violence that the women face. For this reason, I want to say the inclusion gender-based violence in Article 83 would have been a better option to respond at these anti-gender movements. We must answer to these movements with more commitment, more legislation, and more funding to prevent and combat all forms of gender-based violence. Another challenge is agreeing on a specific definition and system to enhance our information on the different types of violence against women at the national level. The directive stresses the need to establish more systematic and homogeneous procedures for data collection at EU level. And this is going to be difficult because of the difference of criminal codes and the specific ways in which data is collected at member states level. And also because of another fundamental issue, which is what is meant by gender-based violence and how it is defined. Another important issue that I think is going to be difficult to find consensus on is protection. It is clear that there will be great consensus on enhancing the measure of protection for victims. However, I think we can find some obstacles regarding the specific protection measures for children on women victims of violence. And especially when the visiting agreements are used by the parents, by the aggressors, to maintain the aggression, the harassment, and the control of the victims. We need to explore all possibilities. For example, prohibiting visiting harassment in the context of a protection order for gender-based violence, or allowing visiting harassment to be suspended when the parent is involved in a procedure of the violence against women. It's very complicated. I think this will be difficult to find a consensus, but I think it is very important in this directive. Okay, I am sure will be more difficult, but I signed some obstacles and difficult consensus. But I am sure in the European Parliament we will work to improve this directive and to find the big agreements between different groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really very, very good to give us your assessment of where things are at, how things, particularly in relation to the obstacles. I think you pointed out some of those key issues, particularly in terms of the definitions and in terms of maybe the backlash. I think that we've heard that loud and clear, that there is, an anti-feminist movement, and that we need to be extremely aware of that, and we need to be prepared for it as well. So I think what we can say to you today is that you can also count on us, that we will be by your side in terms of pushback and in terms of resisting those strong forces. We can't deny that they're not there. They're very strong forces. And as you say, not just in the European level, but it's also in national contexts as well. So that's even more so why we all have to really work together and really to see where those, where we can, make that resistance. But thank you very much as well for your assessment and for what you feel is also missing, and some of the issues that you will be working on, and particularly sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we do have some questions coming through the chat, but perhaps I'll come back to them later once we have heard from our two other speakers. And some of those questions do relate to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and particularly relating to women with disabilities as well. So thank you very much again. So I'm now going to move on to Marceline Nodi, and thank you so much for joining us. We're very, very pleased to have you here with us today. You're former president of the Grevio, which is an independent group of experts mandated by the Istanbul Convention to make sure that the implementation and that the standards are being met in relation to the actual treaty of the Istanbul Convention. I don't think I need to say what the Istanbul Convention is. I think we all know it, but just to say that it's on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence, more known as the Istanbul Convention. It's already over 10 years now, 11 years, with a lot of ups and downs, let's put it that way. But I do want to quote something that Marceline said. If I can find my notes now, you said it was the lifeline. It is the lifeline, I should say, the lifeline for women and girls, an essential component of the human rights framework in Europe. So I would like to ask you to tell us in which way the proposed directive will add to the standards of the Istanbul Convention, because it is a very comprehensive, we've heard some of the issues that are missing, but it's a very comprehensive convention. And then you was also just to ask you to comment on, that the Istanbul Convention has prompted a lot of change in law and in policy in Europe for over many years. So what makes it so unique? Despite the fact that there is also a lot of backlash around it. So thank you very much, Marceline. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference as well. Maybe I should start by acknowledging that I do have a certain bias in favor of the Istanbul Convention. I hope you will understand that. It has been extremely sad and disappointing to see the backlash that there has been against the Istanbul Convention, which, as you rightly pointed out, Mary, it should be seen as a lifeline for women and girls all over, not just the EU and not just the Council of Europe, but even beyond. So, I mean, as you know, I am part of Grevio, but I was originally part of Cavio, which actually drafted the convention. And then I was elected to Grevio, where I served as second vice president, first vice president, and then president. And now I'm on my last leg of my second and last term as a Grevio member. I admit that during the drafting of the convention, there were various occasions where what I and several other members of the CAVIO thought should be included, where certain things we thought should be included were actually excluded, which at the time caused us quite a lot of disappointment because we thought the convention could have actually gone further. However, when it was all done, we thought, not too bad after all. And after a while, we thought, oh, actually, it's quite good. Actually, it's very good. And eventually, the UN called it the gold standard. So, at the end of the day, I am indeed very happy with the Istanbul Convention. And in an ideal world, which I know we do not live in an ideal world, but in an ideal world, I would go for everybody ratifying, all the states actually ratifying the Istanbul Convention. I do believe that it is a very important tool for the prevention and elimination of violence against women, which, after all, is the main aim of the directive, of the convention, of where we wish to go. Having said that, the proposed EU draft directive does give us something that is not found in the text of the convention. It gives us the list of computer crime offenses, which explicitly ask for the criminalization of these forms of violence perpetrated through digital means. And that is very good that that is there, and that it is there very clearly. I remember discussions in CAVIO well over 10 years ago, so well over before it was actually the convention was actually approved, etc., where we were talking about new means of communication, and somebody saying during the discussion, maybe these are not so new anymore, like maybe we need to move forward on this. They are not so new anymore. So the digital and the technological means of communication. And indeed, I would say that today they are possibly our main means of communication, especially following COVID, when everybody was locked in and everything was online. Every kind of communication was online. I will also say that I have often had to explain generally, both in public discussions and in private discussions, that, for example, sexual harassment and stalking remain sexual harassment and stalking, whether carried out in the real world or in the virtual world. And the Istanbul Convention does indeed extend to the many forms of violence perpetrated online or through technology, digital means, etc. So when it was drafted, when we were back in the CAVIO, when it was drafted, we were clear that violence against women online was a continuation of offline, if you like, violence and abuse. And indeed, because, as I said, I often have to explain this, both in public and in private discussions, Grevio has recently published a general recommendation to make it clear that explains how the Istanbul Convention's provisions on psychological violence, stalking, sexual harassment, how these can and must be applied to investigate and prosecute those forms of violence that are perpetrated online. And indeed, this is something that we tend to ask about as Grevio now, I'm saying, during our country monitoring visits. We normally ask about online violence and what is happening in relation to that. We can also maybe say that there's some forms of online behavior that are harmful to women and girls that might not come under the remit of the EU draft directive, but is in fact covered by the Istanbul Convention. So this is something we have to watch out for as well. For example, cyber flashing, which, for those of you who do not know what that means, as I did not know what that meant when I first heard it, right? Cyber flashing is the sending of unsolicited sexual images to a victim using message apps or texts. Well, cyber flashing would be covered by the definition of sexual harassment of the Istanbul Convention. And therefore, since the Istanbul Convention applies both offline and online, it would be covered by that. But it may not necessarily be covered by Article 7 of the draft directive for non-consensual sharing of intimate or manipulated material, because of the requirement to share images with other parties and not the victim herself. Similarly, harmful online behavior perpetrated by an abusive partner against the victim would not come under the provision of cyber harassment in the draft directive, but it is captured by the offense of psychological violence under the Istanbul Convention. So it is very good that these are there, and they are there, they're clearly defined as crimes and that they need to be criminalized. But maybe we need to watch out and make sure that they do cover the entirety of possible online abuse. I'm going to talk now a bit about, as you said, what is so unique? Why do we go on about the Istanbul Convention so much, right? So I'm going to remind the older people here about the old slogan, which was women's rights are human rights. I was very sad to see that we're having to start using this again nowadays. But as I think Soraya said before me, you know, after so many years of fighting for women's rights, that we are now being faced with this backlash is very upsetting. But so the old slogan, women's rights are human rights. So if I may, I would emphasize that the Istanbul Convention, in the Istanbul Convention, violence against women is truly approached as a women's rights issue, a human rights issue, because women's rights are human rights. It is seen as a form of discrimination that requires a women's rights perspective in all responses, a holistic approach, keeping women at the center. And violence against women is understood as a gendered phenomenon. It is framed as a women's rights issue and is considered to be the fruit or the product, if you like, of persisting, long persisting inequalities and discrimination against women. Now, when we talk about a gendered phenomenon, for example, one of the things which I'm sure many of you have encountered, definitely I have, is that whenever I talk about violence against women, I get told, well, what about the men? What about the men? What about the men? They experience violence as well. Yes, of course, they experience violence as well. They experience intimate partner violence as well. They experience domestic violence as well. But when we talk about violence against women, we're talking about violence that is perpetrated against a woman because she's a woman, or that affects women disproportionately, which is what makes it a gendered phenomenon. So, for example, what are the implications of this? I mean, we know, of course, through research that domestic violence is not a one-off occurrence, a one-off event, but it's a pattern of abuse, often cyclical and recurring over time. We also know that leaving an abusive relationship is not a one-off event. You don't just say, okay, today I'm leaving and I've left, and then that's it, you're free. But that in itself is a process, and the very act of leaving can cause the violence to escalate. So through the monitoring of Grevio, we have observed that where law enforcement officers and criminal justice professionals are insufficiently trained and lack an understanding of the processes and dynamics of domestic violence, including, very importantly, its gendered nature, then they might not adequately assess a woman's risk, the risk that a woman is under, and they may not adequately apply the existing legal instruments possible, such as protection orders, emergency parole orders, or whatever is available. The Istanbul Convention's requirement to ensure effective and prompt investigation through a woman's rights lens, I say, through the lens of women's rights is very important. So we also, and it is essential actually, to creating a justice system which is responsive to the experiences of women and girls victims of violence. We also see the women's rights lens in the requirement to ensure that providers of support services are mindful, are aware of the many ways in which violence, such as rape, sexual harassment, stalking, etc., impacts specifically on women, which is not saying that men cannot be raped or that men cannot be stalked, but the dynamics of it and the way that it impacts, the impact that it has specifically on women. It's also important, the lens, it's important to ensure that the service provision, the service that is being provided, is free of gender stereotypes and that it seeks to empower women and girls. And the convention gives a very important role to the specialist support services, the ones that have been in many countries they have long been offering this type of empowering support. And the convention asks that their expertise is recognized, acknowledged, and that their funding is secured so that they can continue to play this very important role that they have in preventing and combating violence against women. In fact, Grevio has identified very shortcomings in many countries, including, of course, EU countries, particularly in the way that tendering procedures are jeopardizing the important work of these specialist support services, which are run by women's NGOs, because they put them in competition with the private sector, which they are often not in a position to be able to successfully compete against. I'm aware of time, so I will round up. I'd like to say that based on the monitoring work of Grevio and on my own experiences within the Grevio, I can say that any future legal instrument on violence against women in Europe and elsewhere would need to follow this approach of promoting women's rights, gender-sensitive policies, and giving true consideration for the persisting inequalities, the long persisting inequalities between women and men, the long persisting gender stereotypes, and the long persisting prejudices and customs that influence the responses of the professionals. As some of you might know, I'm actually a lecturer at the University of Malta, and one of the ways that I explain this to my students is this: don't get a fright, okay? Is this: we absorb as we are growing up, and what we have absorbed we keep. And professionals are no exception. They have absorbed these long persisting stereotypes, customs, etc. And this affects then their professional judgments. I would also just like to add that the convention also addresses in some depth the implications of gender-based violence for women, migrants, and asylum seekers. And again, this is something we give a lot of importance to also in our country monitoring. And of course, another advantage of the Istanbul Convention is that it sets up an independent monitoring body that provides tailor-made guidance to member states, that is the Grevio. And having served on the Grevio now for 7 years, I can say that this type of in-depth guidance is generally very welcomed by state parties, and many state parties engage with our findings and are actively working to deepen their level of implementation of the Istanbul Convention. So these are all crucial elements to ensure an approach to the different forms of violence against women that truly corresponds to the needs and rights of women and girls who experience such violence. And I would say this is what makes the Istanbul Convention so innovative and so unique. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for bringing us back to the basics. As you say, it's a violation of women's human rights right across the board, and that it is, embedded in a patriarchal system of where norms and values prevail. So thank you so much for that. I think it's really, really fantastic for us to hear. You're there in Grevio, ensuring that these values and the basic values of human rights, women's human rights, and the violence is understood to be a continuum. It doesn't matter, so to speak, whether it's online, offline, it's part of the same continuum, and getting that to be understood. And when we talk about different forms and different forms that are missing, we're talking about this continuum that goes right across our both physical and cyberspace. So I think it's really extremely encouraging to know that there is an independent group of experts, such as yourself, that really is there to bring member states into understanding that framework. And as you say, in terms of the stereotyping, in terms of absorbing all of the stereotypes throughout our lives in every single space, in every single place, I think it's really, it's very encouraging. And we know that the Istanbul Convention, we call her our sister. So we are sisters in partnership as we work through this together, because as we work through the directive, it doesn't mean that the Istanbul Convention is going to be let aside. It's also part of the same struggle as well. So with that, I would like to invite the president of the European Women's Lobby, Reka Safwani, who has been the president now for a year. And Reka is also president of the Hungarian Women's Lobby. So I'm very, very pleased and very honored for you to be here with us today. And I know that for the European Women's Lobby, violence against women has been one of a long-standing issue for decades, and really a mobilizing factor right across the membership, right across the European Union. And I think that we work very hard as well to make this happen in terms of both the Istanbul Convention and also in terms of the directive. So I suppose my question to you now is, what is the European Women's Lobby's assessment of the proposed directive? Does it meet expectations after all of the work that has been done? What again are the strong points, the challenging points, what is missing? And how will the European Women's Lobby engage in moving forward and supporting our different actors that we just spoke up to now, and making sure that this is going to be passed, and also and particularly given the backlash that Soraya spoke about, the backlash that Marceline spoke about. We are in a very different world today to 10 years ago, and how are we going to strategize around that? So over to you, Reka, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the organizers, Gender 5+, for inviting us to the table, to this very important conference. And I am grateful to be able to be here and listen to the esteemed speakers who have given such a great context to this issue. Thank you. Of course, as an umbrella organization of women's rights organizations fighting for a feminist Europe, we are really very happy that after decades of advocacy from the European Women's Lobby and its members, the proposal for this directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence is finally there and has been released. We think it's timely, it's coming at a crucial time. There have been, of course, there has been the knowledge about the large proportion of women, 1 in 3 women in Europe are affected by physical and or sexual violence, and 1 in 2 women in the EU have experienced sexual harassment. And also of course, the context of COVID, the impact of COVID has been devastating, especially for women and girls, and domestic violence cases have spiked during COVID and the lockdown. So it is, as we also have the problem that the general achievement of gender equality is stagnating in a way or lagging behind, this initiative can give a crucial support for this very, very basic requirement to provide peace and safety to women from violence against women. When we have analyzed the positive things about the content of the directive, we came up with many things. We really welcome the harmonization of forms of violence against women and girls. It is crucial to do that at EU level, to give the same level of protection to all women and girls in the EU, especially in the member states that didn't ratify the Istanbul Convention. And I happen to come from such a member state, Hungary. Our lobby especially specifically welcomes the legal definition of rape, the recognition of female genital mutilation as a criminal offense, and the prosecution of key forms of online violence. We also support the harmonization of penalties and the limitation periods for the prosecution and the decision on the covered forms of violence, access to justice and support services to women and girls throughout the EU, to give you a short list on all the great proposals from this initiative. We also believe that there are things that could needed to be improved in the directive. We think that firstly, seeking the inclusion of violence against women and domestic and violence against women and girls, sorry, in the list of Euro crimes, as you have pointed out before, Mary, and it's very, very crucial. It has been underlined by a recent appeal by our lobby and the European Parliament. This would give the proposal a much stronger legal basis. Secondly, we would welcome the ensuring that all forms of violence are legislated upon. So, for example, femicide, forced abortion, forced sterilization, stalking, and domestic violence, to mention a few very important forms. Thirdly, we also think a general definition of sexual exploitation and tackling sexual exploitation of women and adopting the equality model will be crucial for improving this directive. The legal basis of the directive is used, the Article 83 and 1. Sexual exploitation of women and children is used in the proposed directive, but is not defined in the text per se. And this should be improved in our view. If I may go on, what is also concerning for us is that the legislative proposal does not legislate upon sexual exploitation. So expanding on this to include prostitution as a form of sexual exploitation. And the EWL, as a major abolitionist movement, recommends that the directive should include an end-demand approach at its core, as per the anti-trafficking directive, which already provides this approach. The directive, we think, should also strive for a more comprehensive text when it comes to SRHR, so sexual and reproductive health and rights, and include the denial of access to SRHR as a form of violence against women, and grant access to these rights, especially for victims of violence against women, as per the European Parliament's resolution in September 2021. Overall, and I heard it from our esteemed experts too, the directive could really benefit from a strong gender-sensitive approach to emphasize the social construction of gender roles and harmful gender stereotypes, recognizing that women and girls from the overwhelming majority of victims form the overwhelming victims of violence. It is undeniably deeply rooted in our society, in the social construction around the roles which women and men are expected to perform. So this gender sensitive approach is a must in this. We would also recommend amending the proposal and including the gender sensitive definition to this end of violence against women, drawn from the Istanbul Convention under its Article 3A. This would be a really strong basis here. To conclude, the proposal is an essential first step in the right direction, in our view, and the EWL is generally advocating for its swift adoption and implementation. But we also agree that the European Parliament and the Council will play an important role in improving the proposal. We are very happy to exchange and will share an in-depth analysis throughout. It is also very important to fill the gap between member states, and it is a very strong gesture of political will at European level. You have also asked about the expected next steps or planned next steps, sorry, at EWL. And we have tried to bring in our own expertise and our members' expertise and released our analysis and two key documents on violence against women and girls, one on the Istanbul Convention and one a glossary, which was made by the Observatory on Violence Against Women, functioning within the lobby. We are also in close contact with the relevant MEPs, and we try to thereby further strengthen the text and work on amendments to improve these key points. We will also work with the trio presidency to ensure a swift approval of the directive when it has been amended. And last but not least, our members are involved both at in European level, but importantly at national level, to make sure that this important legislation will be adopted. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Reka, for spelling out exactly what's missing, but also encouraging to say that we will move forward, that this is a step in the right direction. I think the conversations that we've had so far shows very much that we all are in favor of this. We really want it to be, to be adopted, that it will be a process, that we will be encountering a lot of backlash along the way, and that those forces are there. But I think it's a strong message that's coming from everybody is that we're sticking together and we'll stand together in this. And I think it would be good to share our different documents, the glossary you spoke about, the different analysis that we've done, that some of you have done as well, so that we can actually begin to have a strategy moving forward with all our different actors together. I think that this is a moment to say that, yes, we need to be, standing strong together. We need to be in solidarity. Not everything is perfect. We pointed out a lot of the things that are missing, but I think that this is a moment really to galvanize our solidarity and to actually work together to make this a reality, and to hopefully this time next year that we will be talking about the adopted directive and not the process. So I just wanted to pick up, unfortunately, both Lesia and Soraya had to leave, but I just wanted to pick up a couple of questions that have come through the chat and relating to women with disabilities. And I think that Lesia might have answered that question directly. Also particularly with regards to shelters, and maybe this, maybe Marceline can give us some feedback about how this happens in terms of implementing the Istanbul Convention in those countries that have implemented. So accessibility to women with disabilities, for example, and also in terms of funding. The issue of funding has come up. Does the actual proposal for the directive itself set any kind of funding mechanisms? Could we, for example, imagine that in the EU budget or through the resilience and recovery facilities, that we could make the funding of shelters and services actually a condition of that funding? And then in relation to some of the one-stop shop, how would that work? I mean, Lesia isn't here now anymore, but it's, women's organizations, feminist organizations have been providing the support that has not been available for years and decades and decades. So if you come in with a one-stop shop, where does that leave the civil society, basically women's civil society, and how can they make sure, because Marceline spoke about the potential of private operators, so to speak. So how do we make sure, how can we put in safeguards as well, that those kind of things won't happen? So I think we've lots of lessons as well to come from the Grevio and from the work that Grevio has been doing in terms of making sure that those loopholes are actually not there, as we're beginning to work through the directive as well. Then there were some issues around absence of the criminalization of forced sterilization. I think that that has been raised a number of times. And also on sexual harassment, issues like sexual harassment are also missing from the directive itself. Obviously, we see that there are lots of things, not lots of things are missing, but I think we need to come back to this continuum of all forms of violence against women, online, offline, physical space, and the violation of women's human rights. And women are prevented from actually enjoying their human rights for as long as violence in all its forms exist. And the other aspect is the perpetrators and impunity. We have to really ensure that impunity is not something that is actually brought into or is actually part of the process going forward. So I think that these are some of the issues that we need to be very mindful of, and also to work together, because we have now a text on the table, and maybe the next phase is to actually sit down and to start doing amendments to this text, and to bring, because the European Parliament hasn't yet started the process, so we're in good time, so to speak. So it's time now to be prepared, because it is a co-decision procedure. So the council as well would need to be alerted, through their working party, but also with organizations on the ground in different countries. So maybe the time now is to really galvanize our all of our strength and to actually make proposals to the actual text itself, so that then we can begin to have a lobbying strategy and advocacy, so that it really meets the needs, and come back to what Marceline said, make sure that every single woman in Europe and every single girl in Europe can live a life free of violence and can actually benefit and enjoy their basic human rights like everybody else. So it's about really changing that mindset as well, and making violence against women a past history. And there is some way to go, but as we could see from the beginning, after decades of lobbying for it, it finally came on the table. So we must never give up. That would be my message to us all at this stage. So before we finish, I'm going to invite Agnès Hubert, who is the president of the G5 Plus. And G5 is an independent feminist think tank that has gender equality, women's rights and gender equality at the forefront. And Agnès is going to give us a few closing words, and what would the role be of a feminist independent think tank in terms of galvanizing as well, or strengthen our force to make sure that this directive meets, not only that it's adopted, but it actually meets the needs and everything that we heard here today. So over to you, Agnès. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you very much for all this sort of animation of the debate, which has been really great. I want to thank the speakers as well for bringing such important issues on the table and sort of different sort of perspectives. I won't sort of come back on everything that's been said, but obviously we sort of tend to agree very much, and we love the introduction of the holistic perspective as well by Marcelinardi. We are very much in line with the proposals that of change that Reka has made in the name of EWL. So just to try and sort of answer your question, first of all, I want to sort of say that we commend the Commission for putting forward this directive. It's extremely important. We commend the Council of Europe, Grevio, and the CEDG before as well, to have sort of put so much sort of important issues on the table in link with all the sort of women sort of working in different ways on the question of violence against women. But it's not enough, of course. We never sort of really happy. We want to go further. What role with Gender 5+ play in the adoption of the directive? I just want to remind the audience that in 2016 we produced a study which was written by Professor Freshers on ending violence against women, the Istanbul Convention and beyond. We looked in a very sort of legal perspective at the time at the Istanbul Convention and what were the possibilities of the sort of competences and the legal basis for the EU to actually access the convention as well as the member states, right? The advantages of having the EU access the convention, I want to repeat it because it's for us still on the table, was to act as a coordination body for matters of its competence, to improve the reporting by using sort of further statistics like Eurostat or the European Statistical System, and thirdly, to have a sort of binding text for member states with the possible sanctions of the European Court of Justice. I'm not undermining sort of Grevio on the contrary for fantastic work they're doing, but I mean, an international convention is more sort of, I mean, they can sort of make advisory, they can make advice and sort of try and encourage member states to act, but according to the member state as well, it's sort of implemented in a very different way. In some member states, an international convention is almost straight away as soon as it's published in the official journal, sort of applicable. In other member states, it's got to go through a long legislative process, and which means that in some member states, it's sort of nowhere to be implemented yet. And I mean, I'm talking about France, for instance, which, I mean, it's not only sort of member states who are less sensitive to the issue. So we conclude at the time to the need to access the convention as the Court of Justice has agreed recently, but there's still a blockage by member states. I think to make it short, what the Court of Justice said was that all the member states have to agree that unanimity is not required, and this is a sort of blockage point. So not only we had to access the convention, but as well, we said in 2016, and we're sort of fully in agreement with it now as well, to adopt a directive for the above mentioned reasons, right? So what's the situation now? The proposed directive is certainly a step in the right direction, and we must really be fully behind it. As you said, Mary, we must sort of sort of introduce amendments, introduce sort of issues which are missing, which have been quoted, and this is certainly true. But we must not sort of stop fighting for the access of the EU to the Istanbul Convention, which we feel is going to be an important sort of step to take forward. We foresee at the time that for so many member states who refuse we did not foresee at the time when we sort of wrote that, I mean, at the beginning of the convention, that so many member states were going to refuse ratification just because of the term gender. I mean, it's just sort of making a sort of short version of the hatred against sort of LGBTIQ, sort of abortion, etc., which is sort of showing in some member states. But I mean, let's remember that it really shows that how much the anti-gender movement is progressing in some governments, not only as a movement, but in governments of the member states. And this is something that we've really got to unite as civil society, as feminist institutions, to make sure that we can sort of counter this awful movement. So I will finish here by sort of thanking everyone again, sort of profusely, and let's say that is only the beginning. I mean, it's a pace in the right direction, but I mean, we've really got to continue, and the directive, which has got to be improved, that should not let us forget that the convention is a very fundamental text that should be sort of held up. Thank you very much indeed to everybody.
Thank you so much, and yes, and I think you summed it all up. I think one of the biggest challenges moving forward is the anti-gender movement. I think that backlash, we need to be prepared for that. And we need to also, come together and to work together to really, resist that as much as we can. And perhaps this is where with Marceline and Grevio, we can work together as well. You have a lot of experience over the last 10 years of, providing guidance on implementation to member states. What are those issues that you have encountered? How can how can we actually benefit from that experience that you have in terms of the EU countries when they're going to be discussing about the directive as well? So I think there's, we are sisters, I would say, and really sisters are there to help each other out and to work together. So we've come to the end of this webinar. As Ines said, it's really only the beginning. It certainly isn't the end. But we feel that it was good to come in now because it's still early days. We have the text, we know what's in it, we know what's missing, we know where we want to go. And therefore we can envisage to have many other meetings as time goes on over time. So I want to just really thank every single one of you for being here, for staying with us, for intervening, especially the speakers. Thank you so, so much. And I think that we know that we can count on each other. And we certainly will do that over the coming months. And as soon as we have more information from Soraya about the process in the European Parliament, who, the committees, who the rapporteurs will be, once it's all kind of agreed and finalized, we will share that information with you too, so that we can all, begin to start working together on this. And before I finish, I just wanted to say to you that G5 Plus has a number of webinars, as you know, and there is one. The next one is on Monday, the 20th of June, which is actually next Monday, from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 5:30. And it's on preventing and managing sexual harassment behaviors at work, proposals for a transformative approach. So it's the findings of a research that was done on violence at work and with the toolkit. So the findings of that research and the toolkit will be presented at that webinar on Monday, and you're all very invited. And we will put the information up on the G5 Plus website, and we hope to see you then. So thank you again very, very much. And we look forward to continuing this work with you all in the coming months, weeks. We won't say years. We want it to, we want it to be finalized, but certainly over the coming time anyway. So have a lovely evening. And again, a big, big thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.